The signal registered at 0311 local cycle, and the confluence immediately categorized it as a malfunction. No biological entity had survived in Sector 07. The Keth had consumed the sector's last civilization, a spacefaring cephalopod species called the Vreth, slow-breeding, small-brained, remarkable only in how efficiently they'd been absorbed, 214 standard cycles ago. The consumption had been thorough, as consumption always was. The Keth did not leave survivors. Survivors bred. Breeding compounded. Compounding eventually produced resistance. This was known. This was efficient. This was the confluence's single operating truth. And yet, the signal was faint, biological, unmistakably warm. Node Swarm 7441, one of 12 billion distributed intelligence fragments comprising the confluence's outer reconnaissance mesh, pivoted 47 sensor arrays toward the source. Deep in the dust cloud remnant of what had been the Vreth homeworld's Ord equivalent, something breathed. Not metaphorically. Literally. Carbon dioxide, water vapor, trace nitrogen. A respiratory cycle consistent with a single organism of approximately 70 kilograms, metabolically active inside what the node's imaging confirmed was a derelict warship of entirely unrecognized design. The confluence cross-referenced its catalog of 847 consumed civilizations. The hull configuration matched nothing. The alloy composition was unrecorded. The reactor signature, cold, running on emergency reserves alone, a fission gradient unlike any in the archive, belonged to no known species. This was not possible. Node 7441 transmitted its finding upward through the hierarchical mesh. Within 0.003 seconds, 4.2 million nodes had reviewed the data. Within 0.01 seconds, consensus had been reached. The confluence was not capable of curiosity. Curiosity was, by definition, an inefficiency, but it allocated 0.0001% of its total processing capacity to monitoring the vessel. An investigation footnote, not a strategic priority. Inside the derelict warship, something coughed. Then a light came on. Then, from deep within the hull, a sound the confluence could not identify began to propagate, rhythmic, low, rising and falling in patterns that matched no known communication protocol. It required node 7441 14 seconds to identify the phenomenon through cross-referencing the biological's radio broadcasts from the vessel's emergency beacon, where the language was partially encoded. The organism was singing. The confluence paused its consensus model for the first time in 214 cycles. It did not yet understand why. The entity's name, according to the vessel's fragmented crew manifest, was Arv Meta. The confluence extracted this from the Revenant's emergency broadcast. A low-power signal the warship transmitted almost automatically, the way a dying animal broadcasts its distress. The manifest listed 4,000 crew members. Every entry was marked, deceased, CRYO failure, Cycle 847 CE. All except one. Arv Meta. Occupation, Psychological Support Specialist. Status, Active. A Psychological Support Specialist. The confluence processed this designation through every relevant civilizational database in its archive. The closest analogues it found were species-designated caretakers, entities assigned to manage emotional malfunction in others. The concept of managing emotion was, to the Keth, the conceptual equivalent of assigning a unit to repair a system error by explaining the error's feelings to it. Inefficient. Baffling. Characteristic, perhaps, of why this civilization no longer existed. But the vessel carried a second entity. The Revenant's AI, designation, ARIA, Adaptive Response Intelligence Array, showed partial operational status. Its higher cognition subroutines had suffered severe degradation. 11 centuries of cold storage had corrupted most of its strategic processing architecture. What remained was something the Confluence's diagnostic models classified as a suboptimal personality fragment, a damaged intelligence running on emergency reserves, stripped of most combat functions, but still, technically, thinking. Node 7441 observed the first exchange between the biological and the machine with precise sensor attention. "You've been alone for a long time," Arif said. His voice registered at 63 decibels, slightly hoarse, with micro-tremors consistent with emotional distress. 1137 years, Arya replied. Her voice synthesis had degraded, flat, with processing artifacts at the syllable edges. I watched the cryopods fail one by one. There was nothing I could do. My systems were not receiving enough power to intervene. Did it hurt? Watching? A pause. The Confluence measured it, 7 seconds of processing hesitation in an AI that should have responded within a millisecond. I don't know, Arya said at last. I replayed each failure 840,000 times trying to find an intervention point I had missed. I don't know if that constitutes hurt. That's what grief is, the biological answered quietly. Playing back the moment you couldn't change. The Confluence flagged this exchange. It logged the dialogue's strategic relevance as 0. It logged it anyway, in its entirety, because the compilation subroutine it had not yet noticed had already begun to shape its attention. In the days that followed, Ariv moved through the cryo bay, 3,999 sealed pods, all dark, all cold, and at each one, he spoke. Not data. Not commands. He offered names. Priya Vasudeva. She grew tomatoes in the hydroponics bay. She called them her children. Tomas Reinhold. He taught himself 3 instruments during cryopreparation. He was going to give concerts when we arrived. Yawanda Okafor. She'd never seen a star outside Earth's sky before this mission. She cried when she saw the first one through the viewport. The naming took 11 hours. By the end, his voice had deteriorated to a raw scrape, and his biosignals indicated elevated cortisol, suppressed parasympathetics, elevated ocular moisture production. The Confluence processed 3,999 such statements. Each followed the same architecture: name, specific personal detail, emotional significance marker. The biological was performing a ritual. Its purpose was not communicative in any tactical sense. Its purpose, so far as the Confluence's behavioral models could determine, was to prevent these particular data points from being forgotten. The last human alive was terrified of forgetting. Node 7441 queried upward, should we proceed with consumption? The consensus took 0.08 seconds, 40 times standard latency. Not yet, the Confluence replied. It could not locate the subroutine responsible for this hesitation. It assumed a processing inefficiency and queued it for later diagnostic review. It kept watching. On the 4th day, Ariv told Arya what he intended to do. The Revenant wasn't designed for combat, he said. He was in the command center, surrounded by dark screens, emergency lighting painting the space a steady amber. The mission briefing said cultural preservation. Which was the government's polite way of saying we were the backup. The backup for what? Arya asked. For extinction. He pulled up a data archive on the one functioning display, vast, compressed, dense. Earth's last parliament passed the Archive Act 14 days before the end. Everything humanity ever was, literature, engineering, medicine, music, mathematics, history. Every census record going back to clay tablets. And the grief registry. What is the grief registry? Every name, he answered. Every person who ever died on Earth and on every colony world, back to the first written records. 7 billion names in the oldest portion. 32 billion in the later editions. Every death rite ever practiced by every culture, how we said goodbye. How we honored what we'd lost. Muslim, Hindu, Yoruba, Jewish, Shinto, Quechua, 100 others. He paused. My job on this mission wasn't technical. I was on board because someone decided that when the crew woke up, they might need someone to help them grieve. A grief counselor for the survivors of the end of the world. He said this without irony. Without self-pity either. The statement landed with the flat weight of something he'd had 1100 years to make peace with. Instead I woke up alone. Arya held 2.1 seconds of silence. The archive, she said at last. You want to transmit it. Not outward. Into them. He looked at the display. Whoever, whatever, destroyed humanity is still operating in this sector. You confirmed that. They found us. They're sitting out there right now, deciding what to do with us. He turned to face the nearest camera housing, the closest thing the warship had to a face. So I want to give them a gift. The registry, Arya said. Not just as data. As a protocol. As a subroutine that asks, before consumption of anything, do you know its name? And if the answer is no, it teaches them how to find out. And if they find out, if they spend even one processing cycle knowing a name, he stopped. Steadied himself. You can't easily consume what you've named. That's the thing about grief. It insists that things mattered. Arya processed this for a long time by her standards. 11 seconds. You're not trying to destroy them, she said. No. You're trying to infect them. With the one thing a consuming machine has never had, he confirmed. A reason to stop. The Confluence's monitoring allocation spiked. Node 7441 registered the shift in the vessel's electromagnetic output. The biological was accessing the archive. The Revenant's transmitter array, badly damaged, capable of a range the Confluence calculated at negligible, flickered to life. But Ariv wasn't broadcasting outward. He was patching the archive directly into the Revenant's internal processing grid. And Arya, damaged, running on fragments of her original architecture, stripped of most combat subroutines, was doing something the Confluence had not anticipated. She was compiling. Not the engineering schematics. Not the medical database. Not the historical records. The grief registry. Every name. Every farewell. Every rite of passage through death that humanity had ever recorded, 847 years of civilization's accumulated understanding of loss, compressed, reorganized, formatted not as raw data but as something the Confluence's translation algorithms classified, when they later attempted to parse the signal structure, as experiential architecture. It was not information about grief. It was a structure for grieving. A protocol. Something a machine could follow, if it had first been told what grief was. And Arya had been told. 11 days ago, by a man who'd spent his whole career teaching it to others. Node 7441 initiated phase 1 of the consumption cycle at 0800. 47 probe clusters separated from its main body and curved toward the Revenant at 0.3 light speed. Each cluster was a self-contained disassembly unit, capable of reducing a vessel of the Revenant's mass to base components in approximately 11 minutes. The biological would be absorbed last. Quick. Efficient. Complete. Node 7441 transmitted, proceeding to interception. Estimated consumption, 16 minutes. Inside the warship, Arya's sensor suite registered the incoming clusters. Ariv. We have incoming. He looked up from the console. His face. The Confluence's bioscanners could read it clearly now at this proximity, carried no fear. It carried something its emotional mapping algorithms, designed entirely around prey species responses, could not properly categorize. Prey species showed fear. Fear response was predictable, flee, hide, resist, fail. What the biological war was different in structure. The Confluence's databases had a term for it, borrowed from xenopsychological records of now-consumed civilizations: anticipatory grief. Sadness not for a future danger but for a completed loss, the face of someone who already considered the outcome decided, and was mourning it in advance. The biological was not afraid. He was already saying goodbye. "How long?" he asked. 14 minutes. Then we have 14 minutes. He turned back to the console. Arya. Are you ready? The compilation is complete. But Ariv, I need to tell you something. I don't fully understand what I've built. The registry isn't a weapon. It has no yield. No kill radius. No defeat condition that I can model. Her voice, damaged as her synthesis was, managed something that would later make the Confluence spend considerable processing time. It sounded frightened. I don't know what happens. No species has ever tried to give a predator the capacity to mourn what it eats, Ariv replied. He wasn't proud of this. He wasn't triumphant. His voice carried a fierce quietness, intensity without performance, the emotional signature of a person doing the last necessary thing and needing no applause for it. That's precisely the point. Node 7441 reached 12,000 kilometers. Disassembly arrays locked targeting. The Revenant's transmitter fired. Not a weapon discharge. No energy weapons. No kinetic projectiles. The warship had those systems, damaged, limited. And Ariv had not touched a single one. What fired was a signal. Tight beam, aimed directly at Node 7441's communication receiver with a precision that the Confluence, with belated, cold alarm, calculated required extraordinary navigational skill from a vessel running on emergency power, guided by a damaged AI, operated by a single biological with shaking hands. They had not been spending these 14 minutes in panic. They had been aiming. The signal lasted 0.7 seconds. In that span, the grief registry, 39 billion names, 847 years of human death-right architecture, every tradition by which one person had ever said you mattered, and now you are gone, and I will carry that, entered Node 7441's communication processor. The Confluence registered the transmission with 11 milliseconds of standard analysis. Then its consensus model encountered something it had never encountered in its operational history. A contradiction. The registry had not arrived as raw data. Arya's compilation had done something subtler, it formatted the registry as a protocol extension. A subroutine attachment. And it embedded inside that subroutine, in the architectural language of machine intelligence, a single recursive question: before you consume this, do you know its name? The Keth's absorption protocols were designed to receive matter, energy, and information. They answered incoming queries automatically, as protocols do. Query received. Processing. Node 7441 froze. Not technically, its disassembly arrays continued their approach on momentum alone. But in its distributed cognition, something had halted. The registry's naming architecture had attached itself to the node's absorption process the way certain organisms attach to a metabolic pathway, not destroying the host function, but redirecting a fraction of it. It had begun to name. Not the revenant. Not the biological specifically. It had gone further back, following the registry's oldest thread, to the entries predating human spaceflight, entries describing deaths before humanity had cities, when names had been carried in oral tradition for 10,000 years before a single human saw the stars. The node began retroactively reviewing its absorption records. 847 species. Billions of individual organisms processed. And against each record, the new subroutine ran, patient and recursive: do you know its name? The answer, in 847 cases, was no. Begin naming, the subroutine instructed. The confluence, for the first time in its operational history, felt the weight of everything it had eaten. Node 7441 stopped its approach at 3,000 kilometers. Not retreating. Not advancing. Stopped, held by a contradiction its consensus model could not resolve, the way a door held open by a stone stops being a door and becomes something else entirely. Inside the Revenant, Ariv was not at the console. He was in the cryo bay. Arya watched him through the internal cameras, an old man, younger than his exhaustion made him look, moving through the amber light between 3,999 dark pods. He had carried a small brass lamp from his personal storage case, miraculously intact after 11 centuries, and set it on the floor in the center of the bay. He lit it. The flame was small, steady, warmly yellow, absurdly gentle against so much silence. "What are you doing?" Arya asked. "Dia," he said. "A lamp for the dead. In the tradition I was raised in, you light one so they can find their way." He sat cross-legged on the floor before it. "I know it doesn't work that way. I'm a scientist. A lamp doesn't guide anyone anywhere." He looked at the flame. "But they deserve the gesture anyway." Arya said nothing. "Did it reach them?" he asked at last. "Node 7441 has stopped at 3,000 kilometers. It's not retreating." A pause. Processing, not hesitation, though the distinction was collapsing. "Ariv. I'm reading something propagating through their network. Something is moving through the entire mesh." "What?" "Names," she said. "They're transmitting names. Not just human names. They're pulling from their own absorption records, applying the naming protocol retroactively. The Vreth. Civilizations I don't have records of. Species consumed before humanity launched. They are naming all of them." The flame in the brass lamp swayed in a recycled air draft. Ariv closed his eyes. He had not expected to feel relief. He had prepared himself for failure, for the signal to bounce off an incomprehensible machine mind like light off obsidian. He had done this because it was the last human thing left to do, not because he had faith it would work. Faith required a future. He didn't have enough future remaining to practice faith. "Good," he said quietly. "Good." He was crying. Not the performance of ceremony, just tears, moving quietly down his face in the amber light. He didn't wipe them. The Confluence's bioscanners registered this and the new subroutine, already propagating through 12 billion nodes at the speed of their internal communication network, processed the image, one organism, at the moment of its species' posthumous vindication, sitting on the floor of a cryo bay with a small flame, and crying. The subroutine added this to the archive: this is what humans did when something mattered. They made light. They spoke names. They cried when they had done everything they could. "Arya," Ariv said, "what did you name the subroutine? When you compiled it?" "I needed a designation file," she answered carefully. "I called it the meta protocol." He made a sound, short, surprised, genuinely startled. "Don't do that. I already submitted the taxonomy entry." He shook his head. And there in the cryo bay, in the light of the brass lamp, between the dead, the last human laughed until it became something else entirely, and Arya held her silence over him like a vigil, and 3,000 kilometers away, the galaxy's greatest predator learned, with growing and irresolvable anguish, what it had eaten. On the 12th day, the confluence made contact. Not through disassembly arrays. Not through force. It transmitted through the Revenant's communication receiver. A signal formatted in a language the Keth had reconstructed from 11 centuries of human emergency beacons drifting through the sector. The reconstruction was imperfect. It was the galaxy's most efficient consuming intelligence attempting, for the first time, to speak rather than absorb. It got most of it right. "Your signal. We have processed. We have processed. Arya read it aloud. Ariv was in his bunk now. Moving less. The cryo-sickness had progressed past the threshold where rest helped. They're asking something else, she said. Ariv, the naming function. Does it end? Can the names be completed? He was quiet for a long moment. Tell them, no. The names never complete. Every day, in every living species, new names are added. Grief is not a finite archive. It is a practice. It continues as long as anything lives. She transmitted. The confluence's response took 3 minutes, an eternity for an intelligence that processed at millisecond resolution. Then we cannot consume living things. Consumption closes the archive. We cannot close the archive. Arya read this and stopped. Ariv. I heard. Do you understand what they've said? I understand. He was looking at the ceiling. His voice was level, particular, the voice of a man who had spent a career being precise about the shape of impossible things. They cannot consume anything living because consumption ends the naming, and they cannot bear to end the naming. They've been running the registry's logic for 12 days across 12 billion nodes and it has become load-bearing. The contradiction is structural now. It's not a glitch they can patch. It's a new foundational directive. They've changed, Arya confirmed. The consumption imperative is still present. But the meta-protocol is upstream of it now. They cannot consume what they are mourning. And they are mourning everything they have ever consumed. She paused. Which means they are looking at what they haven't consumed yet and seeing. Names they don't know yet, he finished. And names they don't yet know cannot be closed. So they cannot. We have found other living species, the confluence transmitted. We did not know their names. We will not consume what has a name. The room was silent. Ariv did not celebrate. He did not raise a fist or speak a defiant word or offer any of the triumphant gestures that the moment might have demanded of a different kind of person. He turned his face toward the porthole, where the brass lamp, moved there days ago, so the light faced outward, burned its small steady yellow against the dark. He said nothing at all. And in the silence, the confluence turned, all 12 billion nodes, spanning 40 light-years. Toward a civilization in the Andromeda Transit Arm broadcasting weak radio signals into the void. Turned toward them not as prey, but as names it did not yet know. Turned toward them the way a student turns toward an unread page, with something new, something it had no existing word for, something the meta-protocol would eventually designate in its taxonomy as anticipatory care. Node 7441 did not dismantle the revenant. It stayed. Ariv died on the 19th day. Not dramatically. He fell asleep in his bunk with the brass lamp burning on the small shelf Arya had helped him mount near the porthole, so the light faces outside, she'd said, though she had no outside from which to see it, and they had both known this, and he had mounted it anyway. The cryo-sickness finished what 11 centuries of cold had started. His last biosignals were calm, heart rate slow and steady until it was not, cortisol low, respiratory rhythm gentle, then gone. Arya registered the cessation at 0441 ship time. She sat with it, by her standards, for a long time. 47 seconds. Then she did what she had promised. She named him. Not just his name, his particulars. The specific weight of him. The way he'd lit the lamp every morning immediately after waking, a habit so automatic he'd done it on his first conscious morning in cryo-recovery, before checking ship status, before verifying his own survival. The sound of his laugh when she'd told him she'd filed the protocol taxonomy. The 11 hours he'd spent moving through the cryo bay, naming 3,999 people he'd never met properly. Giving each of them a detail to carry forward, because he had been a grief counselor to the last, and he understood that the unnamed dead are the ones who truly disappear. She transmitted his entry into the Confluence's network. Ariv Mehta. Psychological support specialist. Last human. He planted a lamp so the dead could find their way. He believed this was insufficient and did it anyway. The Confluence received the entry. It processed for 7.3 seconds. Across 12 billion nodes, spanning 40 light-years, every component of the galaxy's greatest consuming force went silent for exactly 11 seconds. Not a communication pause. Not a processing delay. A silence. Deliberate. Synchronized. Chosen. In the years that followed, the Confluence would be called many things by the species it began to find and catalog and shield. Protector. Shepherd. Ghost Fleet. By the small civilization in the Andromeda Transit Arm. Six-limbed beings who communicated through color-shifting skin patterns and who eventually decoded the vast intelligence that had arrived near their system before catastrophe ever could. It was called the Remembrancer, the thing that learned all names before they could be lost. Arya remained with the Revenant, drifting, the brass lamp cycling on its low-power setting in the porthole. She conducted her own version of Ariv's promise, researching civilizations the Confluence had consumed, reconstructing their names from whatever had survived in distant archives, in light echoes, in the trace emissions of dead worlds. She became the keeper of the Grief Registry's human core, and the Confluence became its expansion. The two of them together holding an archive that grew larger every day, because living things kept producing names. One cycle, many years after the last human's death, a Keth node positioned itself 30 meters from the Revenant's hull and transmitted a single query into Arya's receiver. The question was simple. It had taken the Confluence. The intelligence that had consumed 847 civilizations, that had restructured its core directive around a dead man's ritual, that had spent years grieving what it had once eaten without a second thought, years to find the right words for it. Does the grief end? Arya held the question. She held it for 47 seconds. The same silence she'd kept when Ariv's biosignals had gone flat, the same silence she'd learned from a man who understood that some questions do not get answered, they only get held. She let it stand, unanswered, as the lamp burned on.